Wabash Carnegie Public Library Oral History Program, interviewing Morris K. Magner Jr. at his home, 580 Delaware Street, on the afternoon of January 3rd, 1973. Morris, I appreciate you taking your time to talk to us today, and we'll start in with a few preliminary questions. Where and when were you born, and your parents' name and your mother's maiden name?
I was born in Morris, Illinois, June 27th, 1905. My father's name was Morris K. Magner Sr. My mother's name was Anna Louise Woelfel. They were all born. My mother was born in Morris.
Tell me about your brothers and sisters, how many were older and younger, and generally the life that you led as a young boy in Morris, Illinois.
I was the youngest of 6. My brother Philip was the oldest, and I had 4 sisters in between me. I have sister Margaret, who is living in California, married. I have a sister Dorothy, who is living in Rowan, Mrs. Fred Van Busker. I have a sister Helen, who was also married, died 3 years ago. I had a sister Elsa, who was also married. She died in 1938 of childbirth.
Did Morris, tell me about where you went to grade school and high school and that in Morris, Illinois.
I started in first grade in an old school building just a half a block from where I lived, and it was called the Lincoln School. The following year they built a new school, and I went to second and third and fourth grade there. Then I went to what they called the Center School, which was the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. And then from there I went to Morris High School, which my freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior year. And my next year I went to Wabash College as a freshman. And my sophomore year I went to Joliet Junior College. That's my school record.
What did you do after you got out of Joliet College? And then what did your career and so forth? What happened?
I went down to LaSalle, Peru, Illinois, and went to work for the Western Clock Company, better known as West Clocks, the makers of Big Ben. I worked there for 6 years, and in 1932 I was laid off along with 1,500 others, and I was without work for 2 years.
Well, you're the first one that I found that didn't work during the Depression.
Part of it, yours.
Let's go back to this 1932 incident and the events leading up to it, and what you did at West Clock and your job, and had you married, and were you raising a family, or were you still living at home, and the incidents during the 6 years that you worked at West Clock, and the events leading up to it, and could you tell so forth?
I started to work in 1926 at West Clocks, and it was there that I met my present wife, and I met her in Rock Island, Illinois, Labor Day weekend, although I'd seen her at the plant, at the West Clocks plant. But I hadn't really spoken to her till I got out to Rock Island. And after that we got together and dated. And as most people, young people at that time, we thought of marriage. But then I lost my job, so we had to postpone our marriage. Incidentally, that was in 1934. At West Clocks, I worked in what they called the wheel cleaning department. I was assistant foreman. We had about 100 girls, and it is quite hard to explain just what a wheel cleaning department is in a clock factory, so I won't go into any detail on that, but nevertheless, it was interesting work.
Could you tell that the economy was slowing down in 1928, 1929?
Well, in 1929, I was 24 years old, and perhaps I wasn't aware of just what was going on that I should have been. But in the next year or so, I began to notice, and a few people we go on here, a few people we go on there. And then in the spring of 32, I got my 2 weeks notice, and I found a part-time job in a gas station. I worked nights, and then when that job petered out, why, I went back home and was there for about a year and a half.
In 1932, then, is when things finally came to a stop at West Clock.
As far as I was concerned, yes.
Did you have any money in the bank, any savings account or checking account?
Fortunately, I had put money in a building and loan. And after the bank holiday in 33, all the money that I had put in there, plus the interest, I was able to get out. And this helped me to
weather the hard times?
Yeah, well, just to help at home. There were 5 of us left at home. My mother had died in 1931, and my father and 3 sisters and I were at home, and we would each put $3 a week into the food budget, and I was more or less the housekeeper in a very crude manner. I did the washing, and my 3 sisters worked, and my father worked. So it worked out real well. Mm-hmm. And my wife, she wasn't my wife then, but my girlfriend, would come up every weekend, and we'd have I would say not much to do when you aren't working. Mm-hmm. So just the company. And we kept the car so that I was able to move around a little bit. But I had several small jobs. I worked at the Morris paper mills for several weeks, but that didn't last. And little odd jobs. But other than that, I was more or less on my own. There was not much to do.
Morris, I know that some historian or high school student listening to this tape years hence won't believe the Depression, or the Great Depression that you went through. How did you occupy your time on those long winter nights when there was no job and so forth?
Well, of course, we had radio in those days. And we had our favorite programs. One of them was One Man's Family. And we listened to that religiously every week. That was probably our favorite radio program. Mm-hmm. And there was always something on. Fibber McGee and Molly, I believe, were on then. Mm-hmm. I can't remember all of them, but I know we did a great deal of listening to the radio after supper, and we had our
jigsaw puzzles.
Yes, jigsaw puzzles. We always looked forward to having my wife. I keep calling her my wife. She wasn't then, but she would come every weekend, and if she didn't bring a big jigsaw puzzle, why, she had to bring 2 the next weekend. And this occupied a lot of our time. But other than that, there just wasn't too much to do. Walk downtown. Maybe we lived about 3/4 mile from town. I'd walk downtown and visit some of my friends that were still working. A couple of them owned stores, and I'd drop in there. And that's about it.
Did you, how old would you have been then in 32? You would have been
27.
27 years old. Were you conscious of the economic policies or what was going on in the world or why we were in this predicament?
Well, of course, they talked about the crash of 29 being the cause of this. But, of course, it went back farther than that. Back in the 1920s was the era of the silk shirt for men. Now, I never could do it, but many of my friends, I remember, bought these fancy silk shirts, paid $15, $20 for them. This was back in 1920 just for a shirt. And the inflation was quite bad at that time, and money was easy, and it was spent the same way. And I imagine that it's a little bit like maybe what we're going through now.
These 2 years you were out then, from 1932 to 34, you did really nothing but part-time jobs. Yeah. And then what happened in, well, let me ask you your reaction. You would be old enough to vote and you would be conscious of what was going on. What was your personal opinion of what Roosevelt came on the scene then in 1932? What was your reaction, and what was the reaction of the family and so forth in those days?
Gee, that's a long time ago, but I don't recall that I had any great animosity for President Roosevelt or to the Democratic Party. I did vote, but back in those days I probably voted Republican, but because that's what I was. And at that time, when you're living history, it's hard to try to say whether it was good or bad. By that I mean you're not very well apt to analyze. You can't analyze it too well, because it takes looking back, I think, to really say, well, this is what happened and this is why it happened. At that time, I wasn't entirely aware of the causes of this depression, except that, of course, the big cause was that people lost their jobs. But this had a basic reason for people losing their job, was that I suppose people quit spending money when didn't have it, and I did not suffer as far as food was concerned, but it was just a little bit different way of life, and as I look back now, it seemed like it was kind of grim, but at that time I didn't have that feeling that I was didn't know where my next meal was coming from or anything like that. But yet, it was that way in a way too, and maybe our family was more fortunate than a lot of families, because we were able to still keep the household going, and we weren't deprived in the way of food. We were deprived in some of the luxuries of life, and we made clothes last a little longer maybe than we normally did. But other than that, I think the Depression, in a way, was good for me and well, I have to think it was for a lot of people. It changed their way of thinking, and we seem to have to be taught these kind of lessons every so often. I don't know whether this is God's plan, but I believe it is.
That's real interesting. I think that's a good analysis of the Depression, and I've heard many of the retired people have told me basically the same thing, that possibly a depression every now and then sort of straightens everything out. Okay. How about 1934 then? What happened?
Well, I'll give you a little background. 1934 was a blistering hot summer. When I came home to Morris from losing my job at the West Clocks, like I said, I got some of my money back after the bank holiday was straightened out. So I proceeded to build myself a bedroom down in the basement of our house. We have a rather large house home with a large full basement, and I built myself a bedroom down there, and so during this blistering hot summer of 1934, I was probably the coolest member of the family. My sister got married that summer, my sister Elsa, and I can remember the reception more or less was in the basement, because that was the only place that was cool. I remember going outside during that summer, and some people had thermometers in their car, and the temperature was 108 and 110 on their thermometers. But anyhow, the whole family was there for the wedding, including Brother Phil, who was living in Wabash and working at Honeywell's at that time. And after he'd gone home, about a week later, he called me and wanted to know if I would like a job at Honeywell's in Wabash. He said it'll only last about a month, but he said if you want it, he said Paul Shivers, who was then the manager of operations here, said that he needed me for at least a month. And so I said, I'll take it. I'll be over tomorrow. I'll be over the next day. So I came here on July 26, 1934, and I started to work in the blueprint department under Harold Bracken. And that drafting job lasted about a month or 6 weeks, as I remember it. But then they gave me another job in the humidity control department down in the basement. And I worked there until, well, I don't remember just how many years. I worked down there during the war in this same basement department. It was quite small, and I was the only one in the room, and I was calibrating humidity controls. And during the war, of course, there was lots of overtime, and I would work overtime up in what they called the optical department, where they made the reticles. The reticle department, I guess, would be a better word for it. Brother Phil was the foreman of that department, and I worked up there part-time during the war. And part-time, overtime would be a better way of expressing it. And it was very interesting work because we did make telescopes. And I remember that we had one more or less hush-hush job. It was a long telescope for a tank. And we found out later, we didn't know at the time, we found out later that this long telescope was to be used on tanks for the drive against Rommel in Africa. And we all felt pretty proud of ourselves because we'd had a part of that, stopping Rommel's drive. And this was basically our main production during the war, although we did carry on some of our commercial production like we had done before, like we still made humidity controls and a few things like that. But the large amount of production and most of the employees were involved in the government work.
Would you describe exactly what this humidity control that you worked on in the basement, what was it and what was your function and how you did it and so forth?
Well, our research or laboratory here at Wabash had done several years of research, trying many types of hygroscopic material to try to find the best material for registering relative humidity. And they finally came up with human hair. And they found that this was the best of anything that they had found, and they tried several hundred different things. Woods of all kinds and even plastics. We had plastics back in those days, of course. But human hair. And they had to buy it in Europe because it could not be have been permanent, had any permanent, what do I want to say?
Permanent material applied to it?
Yeah, you know, like you
Permanent
have
wave?
permanent wave, what I was trying to say. It had to be natural, and they preferred blonde hair. So I think most of our hair came from Germany or the northern European countries. And these humidity controls were used to control humidity in various environments by way of, usually by spray in some kind of a environmental control system. And we made these hair elements here and built these controls. And we had a pretty good market. I don't know the volume of business we did in dollars and cents, but it kept, I would say, 20 or 25 people busy most of the time. And I believe they are still making these humidity controls at the present Wabash plant.
Are they still using hair?
I believe they are, George. I believe they're still using hair, although they were using some kind of a plastic. I can't tell you the name of it. It was a thin plastic ribbon of some kind that Minneapolis had experimented with and had thought to be suitable for this work. But as an old humidity control man, I still say they'll never replace human hair for using in a humidity control as a sensing element.
Who was your boss during those years, during the war? Your immediate superior?
Well, I started with Harold Bracken, and then Harry Kuntz. I worked for Harry Kuntz. I worked for Doc Leland, D.L. Leland. They always called him Doc. A lot of people didn't know his first name, and maybe he wouldn't appreciate me telling what it was, but I'm going to do it anyway. His first name was Doris.
Doris.
Doris Leland. But he was far from being effeminate. Doc knew his business, and if you didn't do your job right, he'd let you know. And I worked for Jim Davis. I worked for Ben Simmons. I worked for Howard Williams. I worked for Don Bailey. I worked for my brother Phil. And during the war, there were, Paul Shivers was transferred to, at the start of the war, or before the war I believe it was, Paul Shivers was transferred to Minneapolis. He had been the manager of operations here. And the secretary of the company came down, and he made the statement later that he had come down here to close the Wabash plant up. But anyway, he was here for a while, and he was manager of operations. And then there was also another man that came here from, well, I can't tell you where he came from, but eventually Howard, or as we knew him, Moseworth, became manager of operations. And it was during his managerial time that Wabash plant probably grew to one of its largest expansions while at the time I worked here. I think before the merger, or very shortly before the merger, at that time it was larger, and it had many buildings in Wabash. But under Moses' administration, the new plant out of Bond Street was built, while the old plant downtown was still retained. And I worked down in the old plant until about 1964, and that plant is now all gone, including the old mill, which Mr. Honeywell would not tear down because his father owned it, I believe, or ran it at one time. But that's all gone now, and it did hurt to see him tear that down, because I spent many days. They weren't all good days, but most of them were. I have no regrets.
What did you do after the war then, Morris, at Honeywell's? We'll finish it out here.
Well, I did various jobs, mostly in the inspection department, we called it then. I was an inspector in various products. I worked for a couple of years in the service department upstairs, repairing returned goods that had come back from customers. We would repair them and send them back to them. And then in '64, I went out to Bond Street, and they were becoming involved in metal fabrication out there. And I had to pretty near learn all over again because I had not been involved in anything like that at my previous experience downtown at Honeywell's. But I worked in the engineering department. In fact, for about 6 months, I ran the blueprint machine. And then the management was changed. We had men come in from Freeport, Illinois, to be the administrators or the managers. Bob Ensler was the manager of operation. And he was here for, I don't just remember, but he was here a couple of years. And then the large group came down from Minneapolis. And that was a period of a great deal of anxiety for we people who had worked at Wabash, because before they came down, rumors were spreading wildly that we were going to be moved out. The Wabash plant was going to be closed down. And we never heard any denials, of course, from management, and we didn't know what was going on. But then when they moved these some 50 or 60 families down here from Minneapolis, we breathed a sigh of relief because we felt like we were safe. And as far as I'm concerned, it turned out to be that way. And I worked under Howard Fleck out there and Jim Scott. And in later years, my last years, I worked under Dick Du Bois. I can't even think of his name.
What was your job then at the end? Still doing inspection?
Well, they didn't call it inspection. I was in quality, but that's inspection, even by quality control and quality analysis, and that's what I got involved in. And after all these years, my last 4 or 5 years, I was on salary, but and I liked that better. Yeah. So I have spent 36 years. I couldn't remember. I spent 36 years working for Honeywell's in Wabash. And as I look back now, they were good years. I was married in Wabash. I came to work in July, and I was married the following November. We just made up our minds that we weren't going to let this depression stop us. And in 1940, we adopted a two weeks old baby boy. And he is our only son, Robert. He spent 10 years in the Navy. He's now married and has a tire store in California. So my years at Wabash have been happy years. And I never plan to leave here. I will not go home because this is my home.
I'm going to ask you some, I wouldn't say personal questions. Do you feel that you are always adequately compensated while working for Honeywell?
Ooh, that's a leading. Yeah. Well, you asked the question. I presume you want an honest answer. And the answer would have to be no. I did not feel that I was always adequately. And I don't know that I can't blame Mr. Honeywell for this entirely. I think this was just the way it was in Wabash. I think Wabash was never a high-paying town back in those days, and but it was always a good place to live, and I guess that I had to decide that compensated for if I didn't get as much money as I thought I was worth.
You would have been rather young. I ask everybody else the same question. Did you ever join the Ku Klux Klan?
No, I never did. My father did, and I went through that period. But when at the height of the Ku Klux Klan, I was probably too young.
Morris, we're on part 2 of this tape, and we just finished discussing the Ku Klux Klan. I was wondering about labor relations at Honeywell, and did you have any part in the company union or the captive union, and what incidents happened when they decided to organize the national union in your recollection?
You said the national unions?
Well, they had a company union first. You remember the company?
Yes, the company union was the one I was involved in. At the time, I didn't know all the background, but I was in my backyard one summer, and several of my colleagues, my Honeywell, came to talk to me, and they said that it's because of, as we call them, outside unions then, we thought it wise to start our own union here at Wabash. So we talked it over, and I think there were about 5 of us. And you probably have this information, George, don't you, about who these were?
No, they put it down.
Shall I mention names?
Yeah, go ahead. I mean, it's private information.
Well, Jim Ebbinghaus, Jim Davis, Howard Smith, and a man who is now dead, and I can't think of his name, Roy Billings. Those 4 men came to see me, and they stated the problem, and I knew enough about these things and had read enough in the paper that I was concerned about these too, and we decided that rather than have an outside union, we would form a union of our own. I suppose it's proper called a company union. So we went to see Frank Plummer, the attorney. And the first thing he told us was that he was the company lawyer, so that we had better go see another lawyer. But he did give us this one bit of advice. He looked at Jim Ebbinghaus and he said, Jim, he said, you are more or less on the staff, or one of the executives. He said, I think that you should drop out of this because you are in management. So Jim did. And Frank Plummer suggested that we go and talk to John Beecham, who is now the circuit judge. So we did. And John took over and wrote up our Constitution and bylaws and gave us much valuable legal advice which we needed to start this union. And then our next problem was to sign up members. Well, we could not do it on company time, even though we were more or less a local union. So we would stand across the street before working hours, or at noon, or after working hours, and talk to the employees as they came out or as they were going in, tell them our story and that we wanted to start a union of our own here. And basically it was to keep out these strong outside unions where the director or the head is somebody that is not even acquainted with our local problem. And so we did. We formed a company union. And I think the first president was probably Jim Davis of the company union. We called ourselves the Regulator Employees Association, I believe was the name of this union. And I served as secretary and treasurer of that union for, I don't remember, several years. But we had grievance committees. We met once a week. And sometimes they got rather heated. And we consulted with management. And every spring management would give us a small raise. Not much compared to what is given now, 5, 6, or 7 cents usually, depending upon your wage level. And that would be the raise for that year. But that back in those days, a 5-cent an hour raise was $2 a week, and that was pretty good, because back in the days before the Union, back in 38, when things were, well, they were really tougher in 38 than they were in 34. And we were renting a house up on East Street for $10 a month.
Okay.
So a $2 a week raise, that wasn't bad. So this went on, I don't know, for several years, and then we didn't do too much. We charged $1 a year dues, I guess, and I guess the last 2 or 3 years we didn't even bother to collect dues. And everybody was a member that had paid their original dues, and they had a card. But as far as having meetings, monthly meetings, we did not have them. But then we went into, several of the employees decided that they weren't satisfied with this union. It wasn't strong enough, I suppose. They weren't fighting enough for the employees or something. That's the usual talk that they give you. So they finally got to the place where they were going to have an election. And at that time, I was on salary, I believe. Yes, I was on salary. And so they got a decision from the federal labor mediator, whoever it was that was conducting this thing, that I was not eligible to vote in this election because I was part of management, I guess. I never felt I was part of management, but this was interpretation. So I had no vote on this election. And I believe that this was when the present union was brought into our Honeywell plant.
You mentioned the 4 organizers that came to talk to you about organizing the company union. Now, the people that I have talked to have never been able to put their finger on who really put them up to getting the union going. Now there's the problem. Now Jim Evinghouse was Shiver's son-in-law, and I don't know if of course Mr. Shiver still would have been here at that time. But I talked to Howard Smith about this, and Howard seemed to be in the dark as to why. Morris, let's.
Ask the leading question, George.
I was when we quit here. Now I think we have our signal straight here.
Well, you said that leading.
Yeah. Well, we're going.
Was that when I asked you turned off there?
Yeah, that's when we turned. Now we haven't done.
Question before when you asked me about whether I was adequately compensated.
Right. We've now we're back to the union relationship, and we're getting. We had a little breather here where we determined who was where. Mr. Shivers by this time had been transferred, and give me the story now on the formation of the company union and what happened and so forth. And as I say, if we want to, I'll put this on tape. If we want to, we'll scratch this later or put a hold on it. Now put the story together.
Regarding this.
Starting wherever you want. You were working in the humidistat department at that time.
Working in the humidistat department. Now the sequence of whether the boys came to my house first or whether Charlie Buckland came to see me first, I don't remember. But during this time, this was in a space of very few days, Charlie Buckland, who was then the manager of operations at Wabash, came down to my place of work, which was down in the basement in this enclosed room, and he talked to me for 45 minutes. And basically what he talked to me about was that he said we must get a union here of our own to keep out an outside union. And there were threats, I presume, at that time of talk of about an outside union coming in here. And I don't know just too much about these threats or anything like that. But he did think that we must, by all means, start immediately to try to form a union here, a local union of our own. And this, I believe, triggered this a local union that we started there. Now,
It really wasn't as spontaneous. It really wasn't as spontaneous then as some people were believing, that all of a sudden that you guys, 5 of you, just sort of jumped out of the factory and said, let's start a union.
yes, I'm sure you're right there, George, because I'm not the one to really push. I'm not an organizer or a pusher like that. But I kind of felt like this was, call it a command or an order, whatever you want to, from the manager of the operations here, that I should get myself involved, and whether the other 4 men that helped organize this had this same message or not, that I don't know. We never discussed this with the other. But I do know that I was more or less given a directive, and I did what I could, and we did organize this union, and we had it here for several years, and for a good many years it served its original purpose, which was, I think, to keep out an outside union. But it's kind of tapered off, and we weren't doing enough, I guess, for some of the employees thought, so they contacted some outside union. I don't remember whether it was this same union. If I'm not mistaken, the first union that tried to get in here was a machinist union of some kind. I can't remember just what their full title was. But they were not as strong organizers, I guess, as the union we now have. And they came in here, and very shortly the National Labor Board required that we have an election here. And while I was still a member of the old local union, they decided that because I had changed jobs and was on salary or in the management part of the company, that I was not eligible to vote. So I had no vote in that election. But they did vote in this union, if I remember correctly, and I believe it is the same union that we now have at the Wabash Honeywell plant.
Was there any pressure put on from the inside relative to, let's call this outside union now an international union? Was there any pressure put on one way or the other?
Well, I don't know too much about that. There were rumors, yes. And the manager at that time, who was not Mr. Buckland. Mr. Buckland was very, very strong, and he fought this outside union quite hard, and it did get kind of bitter, I would guess, although I was not engaged in any of the negotiations or any of the sessions. We heard that things got kind of bitter there, and but eventually the National Union went out, and this manager is no longer with us. So
you mean physically or with the company?
Well, he's no longer with me. He's since died. So there was perhaps some pressure, although at my strata or level of employment, I did not get too much pressure myself. And due to the fact that I was not eligible to belong to the union anymore, that just kind of wrote me off, I guess, and so there was no pressure for me to get out and try to retain the old union.
Morris, how about when Bob Ensler came here with the group from Freeport? What was the feeling then?
Well, there was anxiety then. As I look back on my 36 years of Honeywell's, while I said they were good years, they were anxious years. And it seemed like our business was seasonal. Um, like every 2 years or so, it seemed like we'd have a slackening off, and there would be layoffs. And when something like that here occurs, in this particular type of an organization where the large parent company and the home office is several hundred miles away, you hear talk, and most of it was on the street downtown, not so much at the plant, but on the street downtown, that Honeywell's was going to move out. And over the years, I can't remember how many times I've heard this, but yet it worried me. It did make me anxious. And when Mr. Ensler came, that was that same feeling as far as I was concerned. Now, is he coming here to close this place down, or isn't he? Well, we know now that he didn't close the place down. Whether that was his intention or not, he brought several key officials with him at that time from Freeport, and they did build our business and give us some new products to make and things like that. So Bob Ensler's entry into Wabash plant turned out to be a very, very good one, I would say. I don't remember how many years he was here, but when he left and the group came down from Minneapolis, before we knew that they were coming down from Minneapolis, the same rumors started, that they were going to close down the Wabash plant, and not being very high on the management level, I was pretty sure that I'd never get transferred. That means I would be out of a job. And this, as I remember it, was one of my things that I do remember about my employment at Honeywell's, that I did have quite a bit of anxiety. But that's all behind now.
It really, it's odd in talking to you over a span of 36 years that you worked for Honeywell, and I'll bet you no one would ever suspect that you were anxious over the job and what was going to happen. Does that, as you look back now, does that strike you as possibly being a needless worry?
Oh, I suppose it is, like most worries are. Most of the things we worry about never happen. But that doesn't seem to stop us from worrying. And I suppose that I did express my fears and my wondering about whether I was going to have a job in the next 6 months or not. And I'm sure there were others down there that must have had very similar feelings and wondering about these things. I don't think I was the only one at Honeywell that felt this way.
Now that you're retired, Phil, and this is another personal question, how about the pension plan? Do you think it's fair and adequate?
I'm very happy with the pension plan. The Honeywell pension plan is contributed. There's no employee contribute. They do not contribute to it, and so it is all financed. Has all been financed by the company, and the options I had when I retired, I had 4 options, and I chose the ones whereby my wife would be protected when I died, and I'm very happy with the pension plan. And here a year ago, we got another 10% raise. So I'm very happy with the Honeywell pension plan.
Are you on retirement? Are you able to live comfortably?
Yes. I would say that we do live quite comfortably. Of course, we don't have the expenses, we don't have the taxes to pay, and that helps a lot. But I retired on the 30th of June in 1970. On the 3rd of July, or 3 days later, My wife and I were in Naples, Italy. We stayed there for 2 months. Well, financially, we haven't suffered too much from this trip. And of course, part of it came from our savings. But what I'm trying to say is that we are living well, and thanks to Social Security also, which is the company helps finance, and I help finance too. But we're well adjusted, I believe. I have been retired for 2.5 years, and I think I've made good adjustment, and I think my wife has. It takes a little doing to have a husband under the homemaker's feet all the time, but she's adjusted very well.
Morris, we've touched on possibly most of the items of your work career. How about Mr. Honeywell, and did you ever meet the man, obviously working for him that number of years, and your impressions and any incidents that you remember about Mr. Honeywell and some of the things that happened?
Well, of course, I was very close to Mr. Honeywell. I knew him, and he was in the plant pretty every day. I'd say my early years, he was there every day. And whenever we passed, he always spoke and said, "How are you?" And of course, he was. But it was just a employer-employee relationship in a way. But I never felt that Mr. Honeywell was a strong man, and I do not believe that I soon found out that it wasn't wise to cross him too much. This, of course, I had no occasion to. I had very few occasions to do. But at one time, I experienced down at the Glad Show, my wife did cross him, and he became quite furious, and I just trembled in my shoes because I was working for Mr. Honeywell, and my wife was talking to him. So that I didn't know whether I was going to have a job or not. But of course, that was another one of my needless worries. And
Morris, what was the incident? What was the incident on the Glad Show?
It was a Sunday morning blossom service, and Mr. Honeywell had asked some cameramen to come up here from one of the Indianapolis newspaper, I believe it was the Star, to take pictures down in the skating rink, which was full of flower arrangements, very beautiful flower arrangements and exhibits, and so that these photographers would not be disturbed, he locked the doors to go down into the skating rink at the west end, and maybe the back end too, I don't know. But during the blossom service, it was announced that right after the service, anybody that wanted to could go downstairs. Well, they went downstairs, and the door was locked. And they came back upstairs. My wife happened to be in the ticket office, I believe. And so she went down, and the door was locked. Well, so she proceeded to find out why it was locked, and she found out why it was locked. And she confronted Mr. Honeywell, and but that there was no after effects from that, but nevertheless, this is one of the things that.
Were the doors open?
Now, George, I don't remember whether they were or not. I think they were very shortly, because I think maybe the photographers were about through down there. But another very dissimilar occasion, and it shows another side of Mr. Honeywell. I was coming out of the basement, my place where I worked down there, one day, and he was coming through there, I forget which, and he stopped me, and he looked at me, and then he kind of stood off, and he sized me up and down. He says, "I believe you are just about my height, maybe not too much difference." He says, "I've got a suit," and he says, "and I've got some slacks at home." He said, I wonder if you'd like to have him. Well, you can imagine. My mouth dropped open, because to have suits from Mr. Honeywell's and a jacket and the slacks. Well, I was quite elated, and I suppose for a while that I didn't even think I'd wear them. I just put them in an exhibition at home. But then he was quite embarrassed, because this suit he was talking about he couldn't find the trousers for. All he could find, it was at that time it was a coat with a double-breasted vest, a blue serge, but it was wonderful material, kind that I'm not used to. And so he brought me some extra pair of slacks to make up for this. And of course they're all gone now. But these were things that Mr. Honeywell did. And
did you wear them?
Yes, I wore them. In fact, I found a pair of trousers to match the vest and the blue serge coat, and I wore them. But just a little anecdote about Mr. Honeywell. And during the war, during the period of the war period when Stan Nichols was the manager of operations, I did most of the driving of the company car. And in this way, several times I drove Mr. Honeywell to Logansport or Fort Wayne or places like that where he could catch a plane or get a train. And I had a little conversation with him, but we never got very intimate, of course, because Mr. Honeywell just wasn't that kind of a. He was very tall, sedate, and he gave the impression of almost king-like, I believe. As I remember, he was so tall and so straight.
Did he ever discuss business or ask your opinion on any of these trips?
No, he didn't. I'd have to say that most of the time we went on these trips, there was others going along. So, and he usually rode in the back seat, and of course I drove in the front seat. But in connection with Honeywell's, not Minneapolis Honeywell, one thing that I'll never forget, and this had nothing to do with Mr. Honeywell, but I went over to Dayton, Ohio one time to pick up Harold Sweat, who at that time was president of the company. Had to stay overnight, and I was supposed to pick him up at a certain downtown hotel. I can't remember the name of it now, but I went there to get a room to stay overnight, because I was supposed to pick him up the next morning, Mr. Sweat, that is. And they gave me a sample room, they called it. Well, I didn't know what a sample room was, but I said, it's got a bed in, haven't it? He said, oh, yeah, it's got a bed in. So I slept there that night. Next morning I came down, I believe it was in the restaurant in the hotel where I was supposed to meet Mr. Sweat. And the first thing he asked me is, where'd you stay last night? And I said, right here at this hotel. He said, you did? And I said, yes. Well, he said, I don't understand that. He said, when I came, they told me they didn't have any room. He said, and I had to go out and stay with a friend of mine out in the suburbs. And I always got a big kick out of that, because they gave me a room. Of course, Harold Sweat would never have accepted a sample room, and they wouldn't have offered him one. But at that time, it seemed like a big deal to me.
You got the room and he didn't.
Yes.
You got any other thoughts on Mr. Honeywell or that you can think of? How about first Mrs. Honeywell? Did you ever meet her?
I presume I did, but the memories are very, very faint, and I don't know. I don't recall too much about the first Mrs. Honeywell.
How about what do you think Honeywell's relations, and I'm speaking of the corporate relations, with the community has been over the years that you've been associated with them?
Well, I would say that they have been excellent. We are many times blessed with this Honeywell Center building down here, And certainly we are unique in this respect because very few cities of our size or even much larger than Wabash have been given a building and the facilities that we have here, and these have been entirely due to Mr. Honeywell and his efforts and his planning and his financing. And the Honeywell Foundation is carrying on this work, and they're a great asset to the city of Wabash. And I'm sure that they will continue to be and grow.
Did you have anything to do with building when Mr. Honeywell was building it, or anything of that nature, or help, or plan, or anything when they were building the foundation building?
Oh, I worked down there, yes. I helped Frank Dunbar, who was electrician, and worked Saturdays mostly. And but of course I worked full time at the main plant, and this was just extra work down there. But I've worked there quite a bit. I'd say off and on, maybe for a year or so, or during the time the building was being built. Mm-hmm. And after the building was being built, I also had a few jobs down there. I served as receptionist several times, and also ran the spotlight several times for various shows. And that's...
What did Frank Dunbar have any particular skills or anything that Mr. Honeywell liked?
Well, he evidently did, because he worked for Mr. Honeywell. He did lots of work for Mr. Honeywell, not only as a plant electrician, but also at the studio, I believe, out at where the golf club is now. And he knew Mr. Honeywell. He'd worked for him for many, many years, and he knew what Mr. Honeywell wanted. And he was just about as particular as Mr. Honeywell. I remember that he used to, when I put switch plates on the light switches, he would come and put a level on to make sure that they were absolutely on there right. And I thought this was kind of silly. And sometimes I would try to slip by on a few of them just to see if he would catch them, but he always did. So he was Mr. Honeywell's kind of a workman.
Isn't that odd that I was in Frank Dunbar's cellar on Sinclair Street in Everett?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it was the biggest pile of junk I've ever seen, with wires going in all directions and pipes going in all directions and everything. Uh-huh. But maybe that's the way our public life and our private life are sometimes a little different, aren't they?
Well, Mr. Honeywell had, I can't think of his name. Who was Floyd Webb? Mm-hmm. Floyd Webb worked for Mr. Honeywell, and I think Mr. Honeywell probably kept him busy all the time. Floyd was a contractor, and I believe that he was a contractor for the studio out at the country club, and I believe he was, I'm not sure he was the main contractor for the Honeywell Center, but I think that he probably got it started at least. But he had worked for Mr. Honeywell for years and years, and he knew what Mr. Honeywell wanted. And Mr. Honeywell had these kind of people and they were very loyal to him, and he was good to them.
Did Mr. Honeywell, was he knowledgeable about the factory?
Well, I would say he was very knowledgeable about the factory. And Mr. Honeywell, in my early employment at Honeywell, like I said, he was at the factory every day, not just in his office, But he was down through the factory. And I imagine that pretty near every employee down there at Honeywell probably saw Mr. Honeywell at least once a day. And he didn't always stop and talk or ask you questions about things, but I don't think he probably needed to. He could probably just look and analyze the whole situation probably without asking any questions. So I'm sure that Mr. Honeywell had his finger on the pulse down there all the time.
Was there much confusion with Phil Magner and Morris Magner? People not knowing that you were Phil's brother or thought that you were his son? Or how was it really? How was it living in the same town with Phil, who obviously got his finger into everything? And
well, I feel like I owe my job here to my brother Phil, and he's been very, very good to me, and his wife has too. But when I first came to Wabash, and for a good many years after that, I would meet different people, and I'd be introduced to people, and they would say, "Oh yes, your father taught me out the high school." And I used to get a big kick out of that, but I don't know. And Brother Phil, he never seemed to indicate that he minded too much, but then I'm sure I got more of a kick out of it than he did. And I still hear that occasionally, even though I've been here for 38, 39 years. But not like I did at first. There are a few years difference in our age, of course. I'd said he was the oldest of 6, and I was the youngest of 6. And but the relationship has been very good, and I'm very happy that Brother Phil brought me and my family to Wabash.
how about as you look back now, what satisfaction? What are the satisfying things that have happened in your life?
Well, gee, you don't know how deep to go. The satisfying things in my life. I suppose over the years, the most satisfying thing would have to be my marriage. And very, very high, and would also be the adoption of my son, who is now 32. We have one granddaughter. That's a lot of satisfaction, although she is far, far, too far away. This is one of the reasons why we went to Italy twice. We have traveled a lot, and we still like to travel a lot. And this has always been a great joy for us, because we have seen nearly all the states of the United States, and I think this summer we will finish being in the last 2, which are Maine and Vermont. We have been in all the other states. We've been in Puerto Rico twice. We love to fly, and we love to drive. And I guess the fact that we have been able to do these things and are still able to do these things are probably a great source of enjoyment and satisfaction to us. There must be some other outstanding things too, but I can't think of them right now, George.
Were you always, when you first came, did you become affiliated with the church and remain active, or what?
Yes. I had always been a member of the Presbyterian Church in Morris, Illinois. I was baptized there at an early age. I went to Sunday school and church there until I went to college. And then I kind of strayed away. But after I came to Wabash, and we were married here in the Wabash Church, the wife and I were married in the Wabash Presbyterian Church. And we affiliated with this church almost immediately. And our son is still a member of this church, and we have, I think, probably since retirement, we have probably become more involved in church works possibly than we did before. And my wife was not a Presbyterian previously. My wife was previously a Roman Catholic. But when she married, she joined the Presbyterian Church. I'm just doing this more for you. Tell you something, George, but maybe you probably didn't know.
No, I was going to, that's the next question I was going to ask. We've talked about your wife, and we've never asked her maiden name and her full maiden name. So when we type this up, someone will look through it.
Well, I don't know whether she'll let me tell you her middle name. But she was Viola B. Schmidt. She was born in Peru, Illinois. She has 2 sisters still living, and they live in LaSalle, Illinois. And
what did your in-laws, your father-in-law and your mother, what did your in-laws do?
my father-in-law was a coal miner, and they were killed in a tragedy, and quite early in our married life. So they knew nothing about our son. My mother died before we were married. My father died in 57, so my wife knew him quite well.
How close is Morris to LaSalle, Peru, is where her home was?
About 45 miles.
45 miles. And, so neither side, other than your father, ever knew that you had a son then, right?
That's right.
Yeah. That's most interesting.
My father died 2 years before he was 90 years old. And he and my wife were quite close. I would say they were closer maybe than the average daughter-in-law and father-in-law.
Morris, have you enjoyed good health all your life?
Yes, I have. I had one major operation in 1964. But other than that, I would say that I've enjoyed good health.
Did hearing problem affect you, or how could it otherwise? Really.
Until you asked that question, I'd forgotten. I've been hard of hearing so long, and I've worn a hearing aid for several years. Only in the last 2 or 2.5 years have I worn one at all times. And I think maybe more than people might realize, being hard of hearing does change people. I mean, I don't know whether it changes their personality, but I tend to believe that it does. My loss of hearing came upon me quite suddenly. I mean, I became aware that I had lost my hearing over 45 years ago, and I took various treatments to try to do something about it. But I think over the years I have gotten into the habit, and I think this is true of most people that are hard of hearing, that after a while you do not hear, so you do not pay attention, and therefore you lose a lot. And after a while, people don't get as involved in talking to you or questioning you, maybe because of this fact. And I think this is one of the things about hearing loss that most people do not realize. That it does things to you, really. You lose your awareness and you lose your concentration about what other people are saying or they're doing.
Do you find most people shout at you?
No, I don't. Now, probably less shouting now since I wear my hearing aid all my waking hours than before when I only wore it part-time. And this has been a benefit, mostly to my wife, because her ears are very sensitive. And I used to have the television so loud that it just hurt her ears, and now that's been corrected. At least she tells me it has.
How long have you lived in this house?
We bought this house in September 3rd of 1939. If you remember, that's a very significant date in world history also. That's when Hitler marched into Poland. Well, remember that day.
What did you take it in the present form, or what was the background on the house or the history?
Well, we feel like we have done a lot to this house. The basic part of the house we didn't change. We've added things to the house, and we've done much work inside. But the basic framework we have never changed, other than just making additions to it. And
How old is the house?
I really don't know. Can't really tell on the abstract just when the house was built. It was built by, well, name slipped me. He built this house and the house next door, and they're almost identical except that they're reversed. Our kitchen's on the north side, their kitchen's on the south side. Other than that, the floor plan is exactly the same.
Well, how is it to be retired and sit out every day and look out the cemetery?
That cemetery has always been something we've enjoyed. Now, that may sound strange, but it's a park to us. And while I sometimes wonder about all the money that is spent in stone up there, I'm wondering if possibly it couldn't be put to a better use. Nevertheless, I don't criticize that. But we have never had any other feelings about the cemetery that it is just a park, and we have felt very fortunate that we can see the cemetery from here, because we could have lots worse views.
Yeah. Morris, I want to thank you for taking almost 2 hours we've been chatting here today and looking out at the birds feeding, and the temperature I can see by the thermometer is 36, and it's raining out, and it's a typical January day, and this is George Dingledye for the Oral History Program at the Wabash Carnegie Library, and this concludes Part 3 of Morris Magner.